And finally tonight, by now the gruesome images of violence along the U.S. Mexico border are no longer new to many of us.
Sometimes those same images seen in another context can raise new questions about how violence is told and sold visually.
Producer Michelle Garcia recently traveled to Mexico City and brought back this reporter's notebook on the sexing up and selling of violence.
10 years since I last visited Mexico City, a city of cute, well-trimmed parks, a city packed with busy mercados, and on every sidewalk, an abundance of newspaper stands. What stands out are gruesome images of violence on the U.S. border and other hotspots, coupled with photos of scantily clad women. The combination almost seems violent. I test up my observation on Victor Luna, a second-generation magazine vendor.
No, de hecho no lo veo de esa manera porque, o sea, son modelos, pero en situación real, probablemente.
But in the context of the gruesome images, the women seem part of the violence.
Lo que pasa es que me imagino que al ser humano le gusta aparte saber que la otra persona es un poco sumisa ante ti. Entonces, por eso esa es la expresión que tienen que usar las modelos. Yo pienso.
Is fantasy tagged on to real-life violent situations? Selling sex fantasy from a violent reality?
Tiene que ser así. Para que tú compres algo, tiene que ser algo que te gustaría hacer o algo que te gustaría vivir, pero partiendo de algo que tú algo cotidiano.
That's how you get readers, he says. Sell them a fantasy that's based on the day's news. And the day's news in Mexico is violence. Thousands killed on the border and elsewhere, the result of a complex combination of drug war and impunity. But do these images make light of suffering? Does fantasy frame a bloody reality? My questions lead me to Professor Deborah Castillo, a contributor to a new anthology on media coverage of violence on the border.
In Mexico, there is this kind of attraction towards what he calls the apetecibles cuerpos de la miseria. So, and the word apetecible, I think, is interesting because it's desirable, but it's also something delicious.
A term coined by Mexican writer José Joaquín Blanco.
And there's this whole class aspect to it where upper class people can get certain kinds of vicarious titillation from the spectacle of lower class violence.
There's an emerging consensus that such images foster widespread social indifference. And indifference has long been blamed for the hundreds of unsolved murders in the border city of Ciudad Juárez. Indifference, a former Mexican prosecutor said, is a major reason behind official complicity. As a result, Castillo says, grieving families must puncture indifference and class divide with their own visual story about women.
They talk about, my daughter, she's a student, she goes to school, she works hard, she's a catechist for the church, she's helping raise her brother and sister. All of these kinds of, this kind of language is saying this is a person who's worthy. This is a person who deserves to live.
On the day I said goodbye to Mexico City, the story in every paper was of yet another image. Two mothers from the border city of Ciudad Juárez who had traveled to Mexico City to denounce government inaction. One daughter was disappeared, the other beaten to death by her partner. These images were of women confronting impunity because the boyfriend, although found guilty, remained at large. For Independent Sources, I'm Michelle Garcia.